Dear audience, I'm so pleased to be here with David Ownby today in Stuttgart at the Institute for International Relations, or in German, Institut für Auslandsbeziehungen. David Ownby is a Canadian scholar and researcher. He's the author of the blog Reading the China Dream and also of numerous China-related books. He's also a professor of history at the University of Montreal. David, it's a great pleasure to speak with you today.
It's an honor for me, thank you.
May I start by asking about your personal motivation? I mean, for the last decade, you've been working on the topic of Chinese establishment intellectuals, but your interest was originally sparked by a plane ride. Would you mind telling us that story?
That's a good story, thank you. Yes, I was working on very different things for the first 20 years of my professional life. And maybe 10 or 12 years ago, I was on a plane between Vancouver and Montreal, going home from a conference. I had nothing to read. I think it was one of those cheap planes where there was no movie or TV. And I had a book, a Chinese book that a scholar had given me at the conference, and I pulled it out to read it, just to pass the time, thinking I'd probably go to sleep. And it turned out to be an excellent book, just a tremendous book, the kind of book you can't put down. And that was a surprise to me, but then my surprise was a surprise to me. And I started wondering, why in the world have I not read good books like this in Chinese before? Because I've been reading Chinese books for a long time. Mm. And it planted a seed in my brain, the idea that maybe there was a whole universe of Chinese writing that we were just ignoring, that we didn't know anything about. And that's kind of how it started, this idea that there was this whole body of animals no one had seen before, and maybe I could go explore and figure out who they were and what they were doing.
And that motivated you to do sort of a deep dive into that topic?
Yes, I have an obsessional side, I will admit. It took some time to find the time and find the money to do it. But it came to be a personal passion and obsession. It was a voyage of learning and discovery. Oftentimes when you're a senior professor, I was a full professor at the time, usually what you do is you plow your furrow deeper. You keep doing what you've been doing, and you make your mark on the field, or you create your legacy and whatever. I just set everything aside and started over on something completely new, which turned out to be great fun for me. And I'm glad it was a public service. I put it online because that's where we were in 2018 when I started doing this. So everyone can benefit from my personal obsession and work on translating all these pages. Yes.
And what are some of the basic misconceptions that perhaps we in the West have about Chinese establishment intellectuals?
Okay, to explain this, the best way to understand this is you have at least two parallel universes in China. There's the party state under Xi Jinping. The party is 900 million strong. It has a vision and a message for China and for the world. And it has intellectuals of its own, an establishment, propaganda establishment, newspapers, journals, TV, whatever. It puts out its message every day. And it's a very distinctive message. It's the message that newspapers follow. Many researchers follow it. It's important because that's what China is saying as a country. At the same time, alongside that is a smaller universe which resembles kind of a civil society that grew up over the last 40 or 50 years, in which there are intellectuals, we can call them establishment intellectuals or public intellectuals, who see themselves as independent or autonomous, and they write papers, essays, articles in newspapers, magazines, on websites, trying to persuade other people of their opinion. And they're talking about important issues, about reform and opening, about Sino-American relations, and they're not completely free because there's a lot of taboos around what they can say and what they can't say. They can't talk about Xinjiang or Tibet or Hong Kong or Taiwan or most of Chinese foreign policy, so it's circumscribed. But within that circumscribed sphere, what they say is interesting, and that's I think we don't understand that very well. We tend to think that no one can say anything in China, so there's no point in reading what anybody writes in China. And on my website, there are several thousand pages which will prove the opposite of that, I would say.
And how does censorship play into all of this?
Censorship is really complicated in China. I mentioned the taboo issues. So there's this self-censure that goes on where intellectuals simply don't want to write about things where they can't say anything interesting because they're writing to be interesting and persuade people. Above and beyond that, there's censorship all over the place in China. There's censorship that comes down from the very top. There's censorship in the publications. That's what the editor, well, not the only thing the editor does, but that's one of the things the editor is there for, to be sensitive to what can and can't be said. There's censorship after the fact, too. You can put something up, it can be a personal blog post, or it can be on a website or somewhere else, and they can take it down afterwards. It happens all the time. So it's very complicated. I don't really know how they deal with it on a regular basis. My impression is that for a lot of intellectuals, it's become like just a battle you do on a daily basis. And if you lose, you lose, but if you win, it's okay. So the consequences at some level of being censored are not always deadly, not always dire. You can be censored and just soldier on. I want to be clear that I'm not defending censorship at all. I'm just trying to figure out how intellectuals who are trying to get their word out, their ideas out, deal with the fact that there are all these filters between them and their audience. So it's very complicated and it's very regrettable, but there's something admirable about the way that they try to work through it on a daily basis.
And with the rise of digital media, how has that transformed the landscape for these intellectuals in China?
Digital media, in terms of first just the internet, was transformative in many of the same ways it was transformative everywhere. You can find information more quickly, you can diffuse information more quickly. In China, the rise of the internet happened at the same time that the state largely commercialized the publishing industry. Prior to the 1990s, almost everything, every magazine, every newspaper, every TV station, it was all state controlled, which made it fairly easy to control the message. At a certain point, they said to most of these venues, look, you got to make your own money. You got to find a market, you got to get them to buy your product. And that meant a whole new range of negotiation between the state and the censors and the people that are putting out messages. Alongside that, there's the entire blogosphere, which evolves in various ways in China as it has elsewhere. It started with bulletin boards in China in the 1990s, which were fairly free. My friends who were my age, sort of retirement age in China, are greatly nostalgic for that period because it was kind of free and open and small. So you could say whatever you wanted to and nothing happened to you. Then as it got bigger, then media companies came in and money came in and pushed ideas a little bit to the side. Then other things happened, and we could go into detail if you want to, but it kind of goes on and on and on. It's an ongoing transformation.
And could you share some insights of the current intellectual debates going on in China that you think perhaps deserve a bit more international attention?
The debates going on in China, some of them are visible and some of them I just have to sort of feel when I read through. I think there's still a lot of debate about China and the US breaking up as they have. I mean, it's not like anybody can turn the clock back, but China's rise happened together with a happy Chinese, a generally happy US-China relationship. Beginning in the 90s, when China embraced globalization, the US pretty well opened its markets and sent a lot of capital to China to build factories and take advantage of cheap labor and feed the Chinese market. And this created this circular effect, which wasn't good for everyone in the world, but it made China rich over time. And a side effect of that was huge amounts of American culture moving into China. The number of people who learned English by watching Friends in China is probably in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. They all know Ross and Rachel in China. It's quite astonishing. Other basketball, Chinese are crazy about the NBA. This all came in, and it was a pretty happy time in general. There were conflicts between the U.S. and China over various diplomatic things and run-ins in airspace and in Yugoslavia, for instance. But broadly speaking, it was pretty good. And the fact that things have not gone well at all between China and the U.S. since Trump, if not before, leaves a lot of people nostalgic. So there's still a lot of hemming and hawing, going back and forth over this. Other issues in China that they debate have to do with internal issues, how socialist China should be, how capitalist China should be, whether people like Jack Ma and the other big tech players should have as much money as they have. What should common prosperity mean? There's a lot of debate about that. There's debate about ideas, which is a little bit more subtle, but it's less lively now after 10 years of Xi Jinping in power. But it's still there. They're still resisting as they can.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Are there like almost like different camps of intellectuals there?
Yeah.
Are there points of conflict sometimes?
Broadly speaking, you can group Chinese intellectuals into liberals, which contains a huge range of people from kind of John Rawls, social justice liberals on the left side of liberal, to libertarians and even Trump supporters on the right side of liberals. And that you can be a Trump supporter in China and be called a liberal, which is very strange. So liberal contains a huge range. Then there's what we call the new left, who at the beginning were they were committed to saving socialism, making sure that socialism had a future. And in the 1990s, they were quite fervent critics of the Chinese government as being neoliberal. So they were trying to help people who were thrown out of their jobs by the transformation of the economy. Then there are the new Confucians, who think that China needs to reinvent or rediscover its tradition if it's to have a heart and if authoritarian government is to be benevolent. So those groups came into being, or came into their current form in the 1990s and have evolved in different directions since. Under Xi Jinping, it's kind of flattened out a little bit. The groups, I think, have become less important because it's harder to really articulate a firm intellectual position in China right now.
For people in the West, and I think it's something that you've said earlier, I think a lot of people in China are really good and have become really good during the last decades in understanding more about the Western culture, about German culture, the US culture, and so on and so on. How can we in the West be better in understanding these internal conflicts that you've just described?
There the problem is the barrier of language.
Yeah.
Even if they're saying things that sound a lot like what we're saying, they're still saying them in Chinese. At present, there's my blog that you can read, and I'm not the only translator. There's several other people who do very similar things on similar platforms. I don't know about languages other than English. I don't know if there are translators into German and French. Otherwise, as artificial intelligence and translation, computer translation advances, it will become easier. But it's just, that's a big conceptual obstacle to overcome. We don't think of the difference between German and English as being insurmountable. We do think of that in Chinese, although it's actually, I think German's probably harder than Chinese as a second language. But it's just that. We have to learn the language and get past the idea that it's inscrutable or incomprehensible. It's not. It just takes some work.
Yeah. Oftentimes you spoke about the quite close relationship that the US and China had, especially perhaps before Xi Jinping.
Right.
And how does that play into the soft power game of China? And is China perhaps missing out on something there?
Excellent question. I feel like American soft power kind of ruled China for a couple of decades in terms of popular culture, in terms of sports, in terms of movies, music. There's this very rich Chinese internet slang that they use. And I ran across an online dictionary of it one time. Not a complete dictionary, but just like 40 pages that somebody put together. It was just brilliant. And it mixed puns in Chinese with images and memes drawn from the West. It was just fantastic. And that's kind of what China became over time. This, of course, rubs some people the wrong way in China. If you're a real purist and you feel like China has lost its agency over the course of 100 years of humiliation, then the fact that everyone's watching Friends or Sex and the City is not your cup of tea. So people try to push back. But one of the problems China has now, as you suggest, is a lack of soft power or a lack of quality soft power. In my university, and I think it's true of universities pretty much elsewhere in the West, there are fewer and fewer students interested in China. They're interested in East Asia, but they go to Japan because Japan has manga, or they do South Korea because of boy bands. I don't know why China can't do its own boy bands, but they seem, and they have them within China. They have all sorts of competitions. They copy South Korean culture in incredible ways, but they don't seem to export it in ways that sell China's message anywhere. I mean, I don't know what message a boy band has, other than that the country that that band comes from is cool. That's pretty much the only message. My suspicion is that the government can't keep their hands off of it. If they have a product that someone's going to export as China's popular culture, some government official will show up and want to put his stamp on it or add the final finishing touches. And I suspect that that just ultimately takes away the artistic interest from it. I mean, any boy band or girl band is cool because they're trying something new or something sexy. It's probably something their grandpa would not like. And when the party shows up, it's kind of like grandpa showing up and saying, we have to put our tie on properly and tie our shoes and not, you know, show too much skin because grandma won't like that. That's my suspicion. But China would, I think the world might be a better place if China had better soft power, because it would give people another way to look at China, not just as a totalitarian danger, but as, you know, a people with their own culture, with their own ideas, with their own artistry. But so far, I haven't seen a lot of it.
You've been running your own blog that you just mentioned since quite a while now. What's the kind of feedback that you're receiving on that? And do you sometimes even hear from intellectuals in China?
I do. I've been running the blog since 2018. I don't look at my stats because it's always depressing. So I have like 4,000 subscribers. It gets over 100,000 hits a year, so it's performing its function. The feedback I get, I don't have a comment section because I think I have more to do with my time. And if you look at most comment sections, they're not what you want to spend your time on. So I just decided not to have one. I do have my email address on the site, so I do get mail. Generally, it's pretty favorable. I've been lucky, I think, not to suffer the injuries that some people who work on China have. I'm not quite sure why. There's a lot of interest from people like investment bankers who think that I've got my hand on the pulse of something in China, and they're going to figure out what to invest in. I wish they'd tell me what to invest in because I'd like to see how they're doing with that. There is feedback from China. I was surprised to learn that people follow it. I think they follow it just to see what I think is important, and then they go read it. But these intellectuals that I follow, they sometimes read it as well. Sometimes they write me, even if I didn't know them. I don't ask permission before I translate. I figure it's out there, so I just do it. And sometimes they write me thanking me or correcting me. So yeah, it's a lot of feedback like that. Yeah.
That actually sort of leads me to my final question, which I want to ask you what you think are or will be the key areas or issues that you believe will shape the future of these intellectual debates in China, especially now in the next 5 to 10 years with the next US presidency?
Yes, the next US presidency and the next Chinese presidency, depending on how that goes. I think actually Sino-American relations are going to be crucial. A lot of thought in China goes into thinking about geopolitical relations because it's kind of the whole ball game. In China, they have pictured the world as China versus the United States. And Hollywood has kind of gone along and tailored their movies to the Chinese taste. So how it goes, for instance, a good way to talk about this, before China's rise in the 2000s, before it became sort of a common trope that China is the coming superpower. Before that, liberals in China were in the majority, and their thinking about universal values and rights and elections and democracy basically ruled the game within intellectuals. After China rose, after China was acknowledged as being important and powerful, liberals lost traction because China was succeeding, becoming rich and powerful without having adopted universal values. So liberals really were left with not much to say. So if Trump wins and shuts down U.S.-China relations, or if something other thing terrible happens that poisons these relations, all the positive forces in China will be dealt a really serious blow. And the ones that are on what I think is sort of the wrong side of history, embracing statism and a kind of cult of authority, will perhaps win out. So what's going on now is really, really crucial. At the same time, that's not the whole ball game. It's easy for us to forget just how big China is and how varied it is and how many people there are thinking various different kinds of thoughts about various different kinds of things. And China is very different generationally, too. Most of the people that I have translated are basically my age and are going off the stage of history to be replaced by something else. Young people who think perhaps quite differently. The young people I meet in China and elsewhere, Chinese people outside of China, give me a lot of hope. They seem to me to be very energetic, dynamic, open, trying to think about their future and the world's future in ways that are positive, creative. So I'm hopeful for that. I'm not terribly hopeful for Sino-American relations. They're sort of like a couple that ought to divorce but can't. And some of those marriages work and some of them don't. So we'll just have to see. But there are other things going on at the same time in China that we should keep our eye on.
What is your biggest hope and your worst fear when it comes to that?
It would be very nice if the successor to Xi Jinping sort of said, "Oops, those last 15 years were a mistake. We were on a nice trajectory toward a good life, good material life for us, and a good contribution to the world, and let's try to get back there." That would be the most positive thing possible. I think the initiative has to come from China. In the United States, it's gotten to the point that disliking China is the only thing we can agree on, which is a silly thing to agree on, but that's sort of where we are. So China needs to realize it has the potential to shape the trajectory of things, then it can shape it in a way that would be to the world's benefit.
David, that was very insightful. Many thanks for taking the time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your time here in Germany.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.